great pleasure to welcome George Baird to DAA. It has been many, many years since he last lectured here, and it really is wonderful to have him back at the school. In 1995, George published a book called The Space of Appearance, a book that I think was, for many years in preparation, I think one of the more important books on architecture published in the last few years. Inspired by the work of Hannah Arendt, I think the work really developed an important revision of the history of modernism, and I feel that it's really set the scene very much for the lecture that we're going to hear tonight, and for the work that George has been doing in terms of his work on re-theorizing the whole condition of publicness. In a sense, as opposed to the modernist rediscovery of the concept of monumentalism, I think the work of Hannah Arendt, in a sense, revised through the writings of George Baird, is in some sense a very important thing in terms of the shift from monumentality to the whole discussion of publicness. And I think it would be, I certainly look forward to the lecture. George Baird is partner in the Toronto firm of Baird, Sampson Architects, and he's a professor of architecture at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. His firm, Baird Sampson, have been responsible for building designs and for urban design proposals in many Canadian cities, and the firm has won Canadian Architect Awards in 1985, 1986, and 1991. In 1995, the competition for a plan for the new town of Seaton was won by the Ontario Forum Collaborative, in which Baird Sampson is one of the 3 core team members. The firm's Governor General Award-winning Bay Adelaide Park has recently been published in the Architecture magazine in the States and in the Architectural Review here. Currently, the firm has a project under construction for a special needs housing building for Toronto's Supportive Housing Coalition, and a major project for the Butterfly Conservatory for the Niagara Parks Commission. George is also the editor with Charles Jenks, who's here in the audience, of Meaning in Architecture, published in 1968, and as well as being the author of Alvar Aalto, which was published in 1969. Would you please join me in welcoming George Baird?
Thank you, Mohsen. Let me begin by saying that you're lucky to have Mohsen Mostafavi at the AA, and I miss him at the JSD. Mohsen is right to say that this presentation, which I should warn you is a work in progress, does indeed grow out of my interest, long-standing interest now, because I remember Charles Jenks and I arguing about Hannah Arendt 30 years ago. Here I am still talking about Hannah Arendt. Though I should say, for those of you that are interested in political theory, there is a startling, there's a Hannah Arendt industry developing in the United States at the moment. Half a dozen major books on her have come out, either, well, some about her, some by her collected correspondence with Carl Jaspers and Mary McCarthy recently, as well as several major books about her. She's been kind of rediscovered by younger feminist political theorists in the United States, and this is producing some interesting commentaries, one of whom I'll speak about briefly this evening. And of course there will be, I won't speak about this, but there will be this summer Sheila Ben Habib, again, those of you who are interested in political theory may be familiar with her work. Ben Habib will be publishing what sounds will be the major piece on Arendt, called Hannah Arendt's Reluctant Modernism. I think that's expected out sometime this summer. So there is a flavor of Arendt to this presentation, although I was interested in trying to do something more concretely architectural around this question of publicness, as Mohsen has identified it, than I have done in The Space of Appearance. And there's a way in which this little package of material could be considered to be an offshoot of some of the later arguments in that text. Okay, I'm now going to begin the slides, and I haven't seen them in place yet, so. To go. It's probably a fairly familiar pair of images. In fact, they've been chosen partly on account of their familiarity. On this side is the one of the flyleaf photographs from Joel Garreau's book, Edge City. Actually, switched left to right, I'm now seeing. But perhaps for my purposes, that's not too critical a consideration. Although actually I'm beginning to think that may be a problem, not just with the first two. We'll see in a minute. This characterization of the form of urban life as kind of represented by this kind of bifurcated image is the problematic, for me at least, the problematic point of departure for the presentation that I will make to you. In that, on the one hand, there is an idea about public space which seeks to recover a proposition about it which on the face of it would appear to be irrecoverable. On the other hand, there is a proposition, well, insofar as one can call it a proposition, a kind of a depiction of a kind of sort of set of forces which don't have any particularly considered formal set of characteristics embodied within them, which is seen as representing some kind of contemporary reality with a capital R. So there's a curious kind of way, in my mind at least, in which each of these images, whatever one makes of it in the end, it at least serves as a fairly definitive refutation of the other one. And then, of course, that has produced this kind of sort of curious trajectory in architectural theory and criticism recently of a kind of apocalyptic negative. Yes, indeed, we do have a problem with slides being left to right. Although, again, the defamiliarization effect may be to my benefit. This next. Can you just keep going, because obviously that's going to be a problem throughout. I'm starting. This is just a little set of the photographs which accompany Mike Davis's book of a few years ago, City of Quartz, typifying some of his views of the current state of urban life in Los Angeles. Can I just go one more without disturbing you? Some of you may be familiar with these as well. And then that in its, this one, as I say, I don't think, be critical. And this is Coop Himmelblau's Melançonnard proposal, Newtown outside of Paris, as a kind of design response to the kind of the portrayal of the apocalyptic condition, such as is characterized as kind of representing the urbanism of our time on the part of some of its most consequential intellectuals, Davis being a case in point, as well as by now a fairly significant component of the design avant-garde. Now, at the same time that this little package of images could be said to represent a kind of radical endgame in respect to the idea of publicness in the urban world at the present time, an interesting kind of set of parallel discussions can be pointed to inside political theory. The two leading theorists of publicness in the past 2 or 3 decades, I think, could fairly enough be described to be Hannah Arendt, of whom we've been speaking already, and the German political theorist Jürgen Habermas. But of course, it's significant that during the same period of time that the kind of view, the affirmative view of urbanism, which preceded the bifurcated set of images I've just been presenting to you, during the same period of time that that was unraveling in front of all our eyes, there was, at the same time, a series of major critiques mounted of the ideas of publicness, which typified the work of Arendt and Habermas. In the case of people, I don't know how familiar people might be with Arendt's notions of publicness revolving around her concept of action, as she derives it from some really, in the first instance, some ancient Greek precepts of democracy. But certainly it's fair to say that from a feminist perspective, her conceptions have been criticized, sometimes even severely criticized, as too Periclean, too male, too elitist, too narrow, too exclusivist, etc. Jürgen Habermas's arguments, as seminally put forward in his Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere of 1960, have, while on the one hand they've actually had a kind of considerable force as a kind of sort of cogent characterization of the so-called public sphere, have also in recent years been subject to a parallel critique to those of Arendt. But in a sense, one could say that the criticism of Habermas's construction could be encapsulated in the comment that his model of publicness was simply too homogeneously bourgeois. But at the same time that these critiques of the two kind of leading political theorists talking about publicness have done them serious damage, it's also true that those critiques haven't had the effect of entirely displacing the conceptions of publicness which had been put forward by the two older generation thinkers. And indeed, it's interesting to see how some of the most interesting of the critiques of Arendt and Habermas that have been made by younger generation thinkers have in fact been made by people who hold that, notwithstanding their criticisms, hold the two older thinkers in considerable regard. For example, the American feminist political theorist Nancy Fraser has really, I think, probably made herself famous for an essay called A Critique of Actually Existing Democracy, which is at one and the same time one of the most interesting attacks on Habermas, at the same time that it's a kind of a homage to him. Fraser, for example, holds that Habermas's idea of the public has the kind of fundamental problem of being too, well, I've already described it as homogeneous, but even as kind of sort of presumptuously unified in its character. But she's actually kind of formed the alternative conception, sort of spun off the kind of Habermasian model, where she talks about multiple publics in a very interesting way, and indeed even went on from that to frame the extremely interesting characterization of subaltern publics, those being groups whose self-image is a direct function of their mode of exclusion from the values of the larger society, such as would be associated with gays or certain ethnic groups. Similarly, an interesting critique has recently been mounted by another young feminist political theorist, a woman called Bonnie Honig. Honig's main target, in fact, is not Arendt, but the Harvard political theorist Michael Sandel, kind of principal theorist, critical theorist of liberalism in the United States. But in her work attacking Sandel, Honig has actually found herself inadvertently led to looking at Hannah Arendt via Nietzsche, of all people, and found herself fascinated by what she sees as the agonistic model of politics as it exists in the work of Hannah Arendt. And of course, it is true, most of the critics of Arendt fail to recognize that the model of action which she propounded, even her classical Greek one, spanned political action from speech on the one hand to combat on the other, so that the idea of fighting is actually encompassed within the model of politics, actually as kind of formulated by Arendt in the first place. And you can see if you come at Arendt from a kind of Nietzschean perspective, it's easy to see how this contestatory adversarialism can very easily be incorporated into a kind of post-feminist model of politics, which, as Fraser's constructions learn from Habermas at the same time that they criticize him, so Honig is able to kind of come up with a model of an agonistic politics, which is critical of Arendt's at the same time as it learns from them. So I've been very interested in looking at these kind of adapted models of the politics of publicness as they kind of span between these older generation thinkers and the younger critics and revisionists of them. And they represent one pole of the so-called new theory that I'll try to present to you in these remarks. The other pole is one which is, of course, very familiar, nothing new here at all. Everyone in every architecture school in the world nowadays is familiar with the famous remark of Walter Benjamin's to the effect that architecture is the prototype of a work of art which is appropriated by a collectivity in a state of distraction. I would take the view, however, that this condition of distractedness, much as we're all Benjaminians nowadays, the phenomenon of distractedness has perhaps not been given as full a kind of theoretical consideration, or at least its ramifications for architecture haven't been given as full a consideration as they might have been. And it is my view that not only that the Benjaminian observation is absolutely true, but that it radically qualifies our idea of how men and women act in the world, distractedness being so powerful a component of their experience of that world. Now, the new proposal on the plane of theory, the new proposal that I would put forward here is simply to suggest that between Benjaminian distractedness at one end of a spectrum and Arendtian agonistic politics at the other end of the spectrum, one might be able to formulate a kind of portrayal of action among men and women which would yield up for us a new theory of publicness, which would have implications for architectural space. And in this regard, I would say that the key to this for me has been the body, the human body, and the phenomenon of bodily proximity. And that will be the point of origin for the next little package of visual material, which I will show you. Interestingly enough, the scenarios of scenographic nostalgia on the one hand and apocalyptic alienation on the other, which have been typified by the kind of the pairs of images I've been presenting here, these have the curious effect in common of leaving the body and particularly the question of bodily proximity entirely behind. And as if that weren't enough, I'm sure all of you are familiar enough with some of the extremer advocates of the advent of the phenomenon of cyberspace, in which it's argued that bodily proximity is at some projected future point seen to no longer be an operative consideration in human experience at all. Now, I should say, of course, that I'm I'm a radical skeptic of that claim, and indeed it occurred to me recently that it seemed to me that one could take the allegations of the devotees of cyberspace in respect to the eclipse of bodily proximity as having a curious historical parallel with that famous argument of Victor Hugo's to the effect that the book had in fact killed architecture. You'd be familiar with this, the idea that once the printing press had been invented, ecclesiastical medieval architecture was no longer going to be necessary as a kind of sort of vehicle for the dissemination of religious truth, because in fact every man was going to have access to that truth on his own to the extent that he wished to entertain it. And of course it's interesting that Labrousse too was sort of semi-contemporary of Hugo's. Of course, I mean one of the projects of the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève was, in a certain sense, to kind of mount a kind of tectonic refutation of this claim of Hugo's. I think the truth of the matter is that the book did change architecture, but it didn't kill it, despite Hugo's allegations. And I'll come back a bit later in my presentation with a few speculations about how I think virtual space will change architecture also, but in fact, in the examples I'm familiar with, without superseding the phenomenon of bodily proximity. Now, the next, you can, if I can get you to keep on switching, because I can see we're still, they're on the other projector, on the far projector as well. You might as well keep. Actually, these aren't going to matter. In fact, if I'm going to be showing you Walker Evans and Bernice Abbott photographs, they'll be just as good left to right. I decided that if I was interested in starting to construct a model of publicness, deriving in the first instance from bodily proximity and using this span from Benjaminian distractedness to a kind of more self-aware model of agonistic politics, that one of the vehicles that it would be possible to use to explore this idea would be street photography. And so the next little package of material will be a kind of provisional portrayal of what I'm calling a kind of sort of ladder of degrees of self-consciousness of bodies in space as it can be kind of read through sets of photographs by photographers who are kind of typically associated with the phenomenon of street photography. Actually, let's go back for a second. Just to start off with, this is Bernice Abbott on the near screen, and some contemporary images from the Bronx in New York City on the far screen. Here I would describe what's going on here as simply a kind of relatively low-key depiction of bodies in proximity, obviously, but at rest. In the case on my side of the screen, a certain kind of condition of repose. On the far screen, I think something that could fairly quintessentially be characterized as Benjaminian distractedness. This then is a kind of sort of baseline of this condition of unconsciousness or subconsciousness of the condition of our respective bodies in space, such as I propose to start here from. But of course, it's not hard, as one kind of sort of moves in the direction of heightened consciousness, it's not hard to see other kinds of considerations start to come into play. I'm speaking here of the beginnings of the phenomenon of consciousness of the other in public space. And in this case, this is Cartier-Bresson we're looking at. And here, of course, what's happening is the phenomenon of watching and the condition of focused optic observation beginning to come into play as one of the modalities of experience together. And not only that, one can see, this is also Cartier-Bresson, first of all, there is the phenomenon of watching. Then, of course, that is in itself escalated further by the phenomenon of awareness of the fact that one is being watched. Continuing along this line of discussion, we come for the first time to the phenomenon of speech, the idea of actually discourse among peers in public as a kind of phenomenon of quotidian experience. This, interestingly enough, is a photograph by John Sarkovsky from this interesting book of his from the 50s called The Idea of Louis Sullivan, where Sarkovsky actually tried to hybridize street photography with an interesting kind of architectural photography. It's a kind of sideline to my main argument here, but a very interesting historical phenomenon. And then, of course, proceeding further still and coming for the first time to a British photographer, this is Bill Brandt, again from the 50s. Once the phenomenon of watching and of awareness of the fact that one is being watched has reached a certain kind of level of consciousness in public space, then, of course, the phenomenon of performativity easily comes into play, whereby one's action in public is actually, in part, generated by one's awareness of the fact that one is being observed. Continuing on, it is not too far down the kind of sort of trajectory of experience that I'm trying to elaborate here before one begins for the first time to see the relationship of bodies in space begin for the first time to take on the condition of the erotic. Or, for that matter, to actually see that the phenomenon of bodies together in space actually is also capable of having its own internal kind of sort of dynamic of aggregation associated with it. That is to say that more bodies come together in space precisely because some of them are already together there, and that has this kind of interesting kind of snowball effect, such as to actually kind of precipitate the condition of crowd formation. At a certain point, one can even see the phenomenon become ceremonialized. We're back to Walker-Evans here, as in the phenomenon of the parade, whereby not only are we now talking about performativity, but the condition of performance has actually moved from the spontaneous condition I've characterized previously to one which is actually institutionalized and planned in advance. And it's interesting, I should say, when I was in discussions with my students in the seminar at the GSD where we were talking about this, one of my acuter observers made the important point to me that, of course, the important conditions, the most important conditions of bodily proximity here, especially insofar as one wishes to see it as political, has to do not with the relationship between the observers and the marchers, but rather the secondary relationship between some of the observers and others of the observers who are able to be together. Indeed, they are actually able even to be close together by virtue of the special circumstance licensed by their condition of observation of the public performance of the parade. Then, of course, this is Charles Gatewood, Mardi Gras, indicating that the phenomenon of performance in public is not one which, as in the case of the Walker-Evans, one necessarily needs to read as either affirmative or normative, but in fact can also veer toward the perverse and the exhibitionistic without its status as a phenomenon of publicness necessarily being decreased. And then, hiking the stakes of the discourse one more time, we come for the first time to, well, I've used the phrase agonistic politics, politics of contestation, the kind of phenomenon. Here not only do we have speech in public, but we clearly have dissent and dispute. And here coming, and this is then moving forward. This is Walker Evans in 1929. The speech becoming for the first time not only implicitly, but explicitly political. Once, of course, the condition of explicit politicization of action in public comes into play, then, of course, the form of another kind of the parade as a political phenomenon also then becomes one of the kind of sort of further extrapolated conditions of the argument I'm presenting here. Thank you. And then moving toward the last of this series, once one has got to this level of implicit adversarialism and contestation. This is actually from my home city of Toronto, one of the few riots we've ever had, where the phenomenon of political action in public space reaches the edge of violence, begins to cross it. And then lastly, in one of the most famous news photographs of the last half century, it's from 1953 in East Berlin, the first revolt against the Ulbricht government with protesters fending off tanks with rocks. Now, this span of images then, it seemed to me suggested a way in which one could, I thought I could represent this idea of starting with a kind of a given condition of bodies together in space, in conditions of sufficient proximity that the relationship of those bodies could be seen to be interactive, and that at the same time that was true, that one could actually see the phenomenon of consciousness of the participants in the proceedings represented here as moving across a band of consciousness of experience, spanning, as I said at the beginning of this section, from a kind of Benjaminian distractedness through to a kind of explicit acts in public which carry with them the declaratory and declamatory risk-taking which one would associate with the models of politics which are typical in the post-feminist accounts that I've been describing to you. And this would be the kind of body of evidence that I would present as a kind of argument for the kind of the basic reasonableness and facticity of the conditions of this phenomenon of a spectrum of consciousness and of its legibility as a kind of implicit, partly explicit political praxis with spatial implications. Now, I want to turn to the next section of my argument where I would talk a little bit, and this is the least cooked piece of the text, I should tell you, but where I speculate on some of the possible tectonic implications of the kind of argument I'm attempting to construct here. Some speculations, as I call them, on the essential tectonics of publicness. First of all, I want to talk about visibility, the phenomenon of visibility. Here again, we've still got our left to right problem, but most people will be familiar with one of the images of the famous League of Nations competition entry of Hannes Meyer and Hans Witwer from 1927. This is a project and a kind of theoretical position in architecture which I have myself been inclined to mock. Some of you may recall the famous remark of Meyer's to the effect that one of the objectives of the transparency of this design was to make the building so transparent as to prevent the politicians from being able to make secret deals. Well, there's obviously a fairly high level of kind of naivete, both the kind of tectonics, the kind of perspective on tectonics and politics of an aspiration of designers of that order. But that having been said, I'm coming back to thinking that, naive as it may be, the politics of visibility remains a kind of an issue worthy of consideration. And in this regard, one brief example of it that I myself have used, starting off an image of Fritz Neumeyer's. This is out of Neumeyer's Mies book, where he's talking about the concept of the viewing frame, which those of you who know Neumeyer's argument may be familiar with. One of the constructions which Neumeyer ascribes to a number of Mies's kind of characteristic pavilions and foyers. In this case, he's kind of representing the foyer of the Seagram building in Manhattan as serving as one of these kinds of viewing frame devices outward toward the streetscape of Manhattan. I was recently involved in some work looking at Mies's Toronto Dominion Center, a couple of images of which you see here, and I realized, well, it's clear that the low banking pavilion, this is exactly contemporary with the National Gallery in Berlin. This is the one that has the structure around the perimeter, where in effect the structural mullions support the roof of the pavilion as opposed to the primary columns, as in the case of the National Gallery. But interestingly enough, when you move from the exterior view to the interior view, you can see, as in the case of the Neumeyer image, which I just showed you, the way in which the pavilion once again serves as a kind of sort of vehicle for the representation of the world beyond, except that in this case, the argument I tried to construct was that one can actually see Mies bringing the modularity of the 19th century structure of the city, as you can see those 25-foot lot frontages of the kind of sequence of buildings across the street, buildings which no longer exist, of course, in fact, which were demolished as a result of the following of the precedent of his own project. But in an interesting kind of way, it's actually possible to kind of sort of hypothesize the viewing frame in this case as a kind of analog of the representation of the heterogeneity of the property system within the viewing frame in question. Another example of this, and this is not particularly well represented here. Elizabeth Diller did not send me some slides she had promised me, but I can certainly explain this to you intellectually. This is an illustration of an installation of several years back of Diller's Scofidio at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, a project called Parasite, which involved the mounting of a series of video monitors in the so-called projects room of the museum, a kind of space for small and purpose-specific installations just off the main lobby. And what was, of course, the edge which the Diller's Scofidio project brought to this place was to mount these monitors suspended off the wall and the ceiling in a manner which you can see here, and of course with some furniture attached to the ceiling as well, so as to put the normal coordinates of one's kind of reading of the space into some kind of fairly serious question as a kind of opening condition of one's experience of the the condition of representation which it offered. But you can see you're looking at a bank of 4 monitors here, and you can see on the screen that you're looking at a rotating circle in each of the 4 monitors. And it turns out that over time, one is able eventually to deduce that what you are seeing here is the result of video cameras mounted on the ceiling, on the centers of the circles of the revolving doors over the entrance into the vestibule of the museum. So that sure enough, every so often, you'll actually see the top of a person's head as they kind of sort of move through the revolving door. There was a kind of whole set of these groupings of monitors and cameras spreading throughout a number of the kind of public territories of the ground floor of the museum, in which the institutional conditions of its bodily movement that you're observing, but in the kind of institutionalized frame of the museum, being unexpectedly represented back to you via the medium of video. Now I want to turn to a further amplification of the condition of visibility within my argument, having to do with the fact that it needs to be serendipitous as opposed to organized, or certainly as opposed to panoptic. This is the axonometric of the library from Stirling's history faculty at Cambridge. One of the few times that, well, this is early Stirling, of course, before he left some of the parameters of hard-edged modernism behind, where, you know, the phenomenon of the panopticon is actually used here as a kind of sort of vehicle of control of the library, much as it previously was in prisons. And this, of course, this is certainly, panoptic visibility is certainly a mode of visibility, but it's not a mode of visibility which is kind of associated with the kind of phenomenon of publicness, which I'm attempting to characterize here, precisely because of the absence of the kind of the multiplicity of the one-many relation of the observers, which otherwise would typify it, and which I think is easily enough legible in the kind of sequence of images I showed you, street photographs that I showed you previously. I now want to turn to, beyond these modalities of visibility itself, to some more not optically based conditions of the phenomenon of publicness, which interests me here, having to do with what I call spatiality and ostensible rationales. What I'm talking about here is a phenomenon which we characteristically associate with streets, or at least certain forms of streets, and it has to do with what I've characterized as the ostensible rationale. This has to do with the fact that it is possible to move in a public space like a street. It is possible to move through that space with a motivation which is conscious and intentional, but which is unavowed, and which is only possible because of the characteristics of that space. Let me give you an example. Let me say that there is someone that you want to arrange to seem to run into. This person is not expecting you, and indeed may or may not even wish to see you. You, on the other hand, wish to see them. So the option of arranging to meet them is not available to you. Within certain kind of public spaces of the kind I'm characterizing here, it is possible for you to arrange to seem to run into this person, and by virtue of the condition of publicness of the territory within which this event would hopefully occur, the possibility of your doing so without your intention being disclosed is actually available to you as a real social possibility. The converse also applies. Let's say this person is somebody that wants to meet you, and you don't, under any circumstances, wish to run into them. The equivalent condition of avoidance exists by virtue of you deliberately taking circuitous or roundabout routes with the explicit purpose of attempting to avoid this encounter, which might otherwise occur. Now, this relationship of intentionality to appearance in respect to behavior in public seems to me to be one of the kind of interesting and quintessential characteristics of publicness. And of course, the reason I'm showing you slides of grids is that it's a condition which is kind of congenially facilitated by the phenomenon of the grid, simply because it's one of the kind of characteristic geometries of space which produces the possibility of a kind of multiplicity of routes from A to B, all of which have a certain relative degree of logic as choices without any one of those being absolutely dominant over the others, but with all of them still being coherent as a set of relationships of A and B. I think that this is I'm showing you Candelas, Josek, and Wood's plan of Berlin Free University from 1964 on the far side. It's my view that the phenomenon of the grid as a kind of network of circulation, which was one of the features of Team 10 planning in the 60s, was probably one of the most politically powerful of the devices with which they were attempting to work in that historical period. And I'm not surprised to see, I don't know whether it's happening here or not, but certainly at the GSD we're experiencing this curious historical and intellectual phenomenon amongst our students, whereby the phenomena of Team 10 are being rediscovered, and the issues with which they attempted to deal are kind of returning to the studio with kind of disconcerting frequency, as often as not even unconsciously on the part of the students who are beginning to explore such motifs. At the same time, of course, we can see that the limitations of the grid as a kind of an organizing principle are also apparent here, partly in the inability of the designers of this system to come to terms with the nuances of hierarchy, such as one would associate them with a kind of more conventionally urban grid, such that you would be less likely, for example, in this anonymous city in the American Midwest, to inadvertently find yourself walking into a closet as you would do in one of the kind of secondary or tertiary spines of the BFU grid as conceived by Candelas, Josek, Woods. There's also, of course, the interesting paradox of the status of the perimeter and of its kind of sort of its conditions of representation in relation to the grid, which, of course, as we all know, was a circumstance which Team 10 never really succeeded in coming to grips with. But that doesn't mean that the kind of the condition of multilateral choice, such as kind of represented by these geometries, doesn't remain a pressing consideration for us. Oh. I'm also, the famous historical example of the passage is interesting for my purposes here as well, because it also, it relates as powerfully to the kind of phenomenon of the ostensible rationale as the grid does, because of course, as we know, the whole logic, actually maybe the pointer will be useful here, the whole logic of the conception of the creation of a passage was it had to go all the way through the block. And as you can see, in some of these cases, there are kind of sort of circumstantial jogs which are kind of necessitated by the kind of particular circumstances of property ownership. But the point is that the system has to be a continuous one, and indeed, if you look across a kind of chunk of the fabric of 19th century Paris, such as is represented in this image as a whole, you can even see where there's a kind of a cumulative logic having to do with the desirability of aligning one of these systems in one block with another of them on another block. And of course, the whole point of this is that insofar as the strategy of multiplying the amount of retail frontage which is available to the shopper by virtue of making these through-block routes is going to be a kind of efficacious commercial proposition, it depends on the fact that the continuity of the system will facilitate its use by people taking shortcuts who have no intention of buying anything, but whose kind of movement through the system may or may not cause them to reconsider the question of purchase, and will certainly kind of sort of generate a condition of animated inhabitations such as to kind of sort of facilitate the phenomenon of shopping as a kind of broader social phenomenon, irrespective of the particular intentions of any person moving through. Another set of these can be seen here, or then finally, again, one can see the kind of multiplicity of the system producing this kind of, it's like a fire spreading in a wooden building, the kind of same kind of phenomena of kind of sort of catalytic extent apply in both cases. Then I wanted to turn to another of the phenomena which seem to me to kind of sort of typify this condition of publicness I've been describing. And this has to do with the phenomena of edges and centers, and what I'm characterizing as kind of relative degrees of focality. And it's interesting to me that the porch is obviously a kind of sort of classic phenomenon of edgeness, as it were, which produces this interesting kind of threshold condition between the back, or the kind of, the surface of the world, to which one, in effect, puts one's back, with then the possibility of visibility outward toward the larger social world beyond, at the same time that one is in this condition of kind of sort of relative separatedness in relation to that larger condition beyond. And so that the notion of the kind of phenomenon of publicness existing quintessentially within this edge zone, not beyond the back on the one hand, nor, interestingly enough, all that powerfully out in the center either, is an interesting kind of point to ponder. And I can speak to this question more explicitly in the case of this detail of Rockefeller Center, where one can see, if one looks to the kind of periphery, the upper periphery of the space, one can see this interesting phenomenon whereby the conventional street sidewalk moves round three sides of the space in question. I showed how to use this, and I can't find the button. Oh, is it slide? Ah, got you. Okay, thanks. You can see the street sidewalk. There you can see there are cars moving in the on the normal street pavement. There's the street sidewalk. That same condition applies here. Then there are steps down, which you can see here, which lead to this kind of zone which is lower than the street sidewalk here, and which is separated from it by this planter. And then that produces this kind of lower zone here. So there's a kind of double condition of overlook. First from the street sidewalk here, and then secondly from this kind of sort of intermediate condition here. You're seeing the same thing occurring on this edge here, where this is the planter, which is symmetrical to this one over here. So that the kind of the pure condition of Benjaminian distractedness can operate on the kind of street sidewalk at the curb edge, at the same time that this kind of sort of relative degree of progressively increasing attraction toward the event at the center may or may not draw some kind of curious passers-by toward the condition of overlook along this edge. Now, and the other thing which is interesting about this, of course, is that, of course, what we're looking at as the event in this case is one of these non-spontaneous performances like the parades I've showed you earlier, and again, interesting discussion about how when this territory is open, which doesn't happen much anymore, it's usually programmed one way or another, but on the rare occasions when it's open, it actually is not as public as the edge conditions because the degree of focality which is generated by its section and its geometry is so powerful as to actually kind of impose the obligation of performance upon anybody who actually kind of proposes to occupy this territory, even circumstantially or inadvertently. Another interesting kind of current mutation of some of these kinds of ideas can be seen in this proposition of my Harvard colleagues, Machado and Silvetti. This is one of the more interesting of their public space projects for the Piazza Dante in Genoa, unbuilt project, where again, a kind of leftover piece of space as a kind of sort of result of city center traffic engineering was proposed by the conditions of this competition to be turned into something more, somewhat more, formally rendered a territory of public inhabitation. In this case, Machado and Silvetti do indeed propose a marked surface of some degree of explicitness, albeit one which is coterminous with ordinary street sidewalk here. Again, some more of that absolutely banal curb. But the thing cuts into a slope, such as you can see in the perspective here, where there's a rise of land of about a couple of stories, which gets you up to the level of the fragment of ancient wall, which you see in the background here, producing then the lower level at the street here, a kind of an intermediary level on this platform here, and then something at the height of at the foot of the wall back beyond that again. And in this case then, the proposition of a kind of flat surface, admittedly marked by a paving pattern, but not much else, then a pool surmounted by this upper platform, which you can see in the distance here, at the back of which is a simple colonnade. And then the lower level and the intermediate level are then linked by this device, which occupies this kind of interesting category, intermediary. It is a flight of steps. It's also a set of bleachers. And it produces an interesting kind of condition of it's a kind of reversible or kind of sort of multi-spatial focality, whereby you can read this thing as a kind of an available surface for crowds in respect to display or performance which could occur at this zone here, or conversely, the image is just as easily legible reversibly, where this thing operates as bleachers in respect to possible activity occurring on this surface here, which you can imagine has the same kind of phenomenological characteristics as you would associate with a basketball court or a dance floor. Well, obviously, so far as it's basketball, the bleacher analogy is apt. And in which case, then this would then become the back of the house or the kind of row across the end of the seating. So that the thing kind of operates as a kind of system of continuous movements of public itinerary through the kind of grain of the city as a whole, at the same time as it carries with it these spatial inflections, which have which carry with them the propensity to kind of accommodate latent psychological or social focalities as they might manifest themselves within the general territory of its location. The next thing I want to talk about has to do with the looking a bit more closely at the phenomenon of the floor as a kind of condition of a support for praxes of the kind I'm talking about, since a project like this tends to bring it to the kind of forefront of our thinking. But in this case, I wanted to actually turn to a kind of recent project of Koolhaas where, and I haven't discussed this with them, but where it seems to me there's an interesting phenomenon in relation to the horizontal and the vertical going on, which is of interest to me. I'm going to talk about the Jussieu library here, but I'm contrasting it with a couple of earlier projects of Koolhaas, such as we're seeing here, the Très Grande Bibliothèque or the Karlsruhe Mediathek, where in both of these cases the condition of the program of the institution, which is continuous in the case of the library, the kind of the various stacks of the building, the kind of the overall kind of sort of program ingredient, is kind of punctuated by these kind of sort of particular conditions which lend it its kind of spatial and formal piquancy. But it's also kind of interrupted by these kind of systems of vertical circulation. And so that's the kind of sort of primary relationship of kind of horizontal to vertical elements within the three-dimensional volumetrics of the scheme of the building. In the case of the Mediathek, which the vertical circulation slot of which is depicted on the far side, I'm associating this with the phenomenon of the atrium, such as we know it from the Portman buildings, by which, of course, we know Koolhaas to be somewhat fascinated, where you have the condition of kind of the putatively sublime verticality, as it were, represented by the kind of slot of space moving vertically through the section of the building in a condition of adjacency to these kind of sort of lateral conditions of program, such as similarly to what we're seeing in the Très Grande Bibliothèque on the other side. My experience, anyone who's been in a Portman hotel can judge this for themselves, but it's always been my experience that there's this odd condition where the radical discrepancy between the degree of verticality of the spatial reference in relation to the horizontal is such that these vertical interior voids don't have the effect of bringing together, they don't have the effect of generating a kind of enhanced condition of panoramic visibility. In fact, they have, if anything, they have the effect of kind of breaking up your condition of perception. It's certainly kind of highly animated and stimulative, but it's not particularly kind of legible or contemplative. In fact, again, another of the students in the seminar with which I've been working with this material has just given me a paper in which he actually makes an argument that this is a sort of semi-conscious design intention on Portman's part, and he actually thinks that the tendency of Portman to always have water at the bottom of these vertical shafts is actually also associated with the phenomenon of getting rid of the floor, radically suppressing the condition of the horizontal as a kind of appropriable surface in favor of this kind of vertiginous condition of heterogeneous vertical array, but which is nevertheless unappropriable collectively or socially. I think it's a very interesting argument, and I'm inclined to think I'm persuaded by it. In any event, to come back to Koolhaas, the conclusion I'm coming to is that in the move from these projects of, 5 to 10 years ago to Jussieu, the Portman problem has been identified here, and this condition of kind of radical verticality is beginning to be seen as insufficient in terms of the ambitions of the project to act as social condensers. And so when we come to a phenomenon like the Je suis a library, which of course is in which Koolhaas makes its debt to Team 10 explicit, or at least he has done at the GSD in early presentations of this project. Here, of course, as probably most of you, I expect, are familiar with this project, but the idea here is to take it's another library, of course, but rather than kind of stack up the floors in stratifications, which are then penetrated by either voids or vertical systems of movement, the idea is to take the floor, tip it up, and make it continuous. And you can see here on the screen closest to me how by means of a certain kind of gradually ascending slope spiral, the thing is attempting to actually make a spatially continuous ascending sloping floor, which kind of gradually loops around, cut by sufficient intermediary voids as to kind of sort of generate constant conditions of circumstantial kind of overlook and high, an extensive degree of kind of conditions of kind of sort of radical visible proximity of men and women to others. Now there are some dynamics here that are yet to be kind of worked out. Obviously the question of the precise degree of the slope is an interesting one, but it did seem to me to suggest that this question of the fact that the floor performs such a powerful role in social psychological terms for the kinds of arguments that I'm presenting here, and yet the condition of overlook is also such a kind of powerful one in terms of multiplying the conditions of visibility which seem to go with the various modalities of publicness, such as I've been attempting to present them to you. It suggests to me that this idea of the tipped floor, and even more, I suppose, of the continuous tipped floor, is actually potentially a very provocative one in terms of a kind of an exfoliation of conditions of publicness. And it seems to me it's kind of radically different in its social psychological characteristics than the continuous vertical Portman-esque void, such as seem to be typical of the immediately preceding pair of projects. A couple of last remarks before concluding. I'm also interested in one of the other characteristic arguments of the advocates of the urban apocalypse is, of course, that if the computer hasn't killed public space, then surely the car has. And of course, this is a slippery argument to argue against, since there is, of course, some truth to it. But once again, I've been interested in speculating on the extent to which one can find relative counter-arguments in respect to this proposition. This is an interesting case of the main street of my own home city of Toronto, in which a brief and fortunately brief and quickly aborted experiment with turning the main street into a pedestrian mall was abandoned, and in which it was easily possible to observe that in this kind of condition of relative speed of automobiles, relative proximity of vehicles and pedestrians, and relative kind of dimensions of habitable spaces for persons either in vehicles or outside of them, that the space is more, carries with it more of the characteristics of heterogeneous, serendipitous circumstance with the vehicles than it does without them. And there's, in fact, an interesting kind of sort of flattening out of its characteristics of publicness as a result of its kind of sort of the sterilization of the automobile. We've been in my seminar speculating on other examples of this, which I have as yet been unable to capture in photographs. Finally, to come to the last kind of modality of mutant publicness that I would comment on, just to kind of return to the phenomenon of cybersphere. These are also left to right, of course. This was the exhibition that Toyo Ito did in London a few years ago. I'm interested in Ito in this discussion because, and had Diller given me the slides, I would have included a recent project of hers here as well, because it does seem to me that this, I think, is a failed project, because obviously, well, to the extent that this project kind of falls within the territory of my argument, it is because the virtual reality is seen as a kind of sort of doubling of the actual condition of inhabitation of the space, so that there's actually, rather than the proximity of my body to yours being replaced via the medium of virtual reality, there's actually a kind of doubling up of that condition by virtue of its kind of representation back to us within the actual physical space which we occupy together simultaneously. I do think that, there's clearly the kind of sort of potential of that kind of possibility of orchestrating the relationship of virtual images to conditions of bodily actuality, which it seems to me to be one of the kind of likely mutants within which it seems to me that architecture will be changed rather than killed by these phenomena. Liz Diller, the project which Liz Diller showed us, is an interesting kind of a commercial adaptation of the technology of the Parasite project, which I showed you earlier in this presentation. Interesting, it's a paradoxical project. It's a public art installation in a commercial project in an American city, San Jose, California, in which a kind of percent for art program requires the developer to include an art component as part of the design of the project. In this case, the project is a cinema multiplex with a big, I think it's a very large number, like something like 24 cinemas, which have a large multi-story atrium with mezzanines giving access to the various auditoria of the multiplex, which are then accessed by systems of escalators inside this big glassed void. Her project, the Diller Scofidio art installation in this project, is a set of liquid crystal displays which serve as marquees for the movies which are playing in the 24 auditoria. So they can, obviously, as LCDs can do, they can show whatever they're programmed to show, but they kind of range between advertisements for the movies, depictions of scenes from the movies, and also representations of the activity of the crowd in the atrium, moving back and forth up and down the escalators, buying their popcorn and so forth. All of this kind of sort of represented on the facade of the building, so that, again, you can see why I would think of this in the context of the Ito examples I've been describing to you here. Okay, those are my provisional speculations on some of the modalities of some speculations as to the kind of tectonics of publicness as they might arise out of the kind of new theory on which I have been working here. And the last example of it I would offer you, which would take me back to the Benjamin Arendt band of experience with which I began, would be to ask you to think of a kind of imaginary space in which would be configured with such characteristics of inhabitable surfaces, locatable edges, overlooks and outlooks, as to accommodate a social condition in which an individual who was not customarily inclined to do so might find himself joining dancers on the floor. Thank you. Wilson says there may be questions.
Your kind of definition of public space hangs on really the relation of several bodies to each other and presumably like the space between. Now, I can see on the one hand why you use the category of the body. Politically, it avoids any of the exclusionism of a category like the citizen, as might have appeared in classical political philosophy. But I'd really like to ask about the consequences of you putting it in terms of it having to be several or many, because the relations which for you were supported by the existence of many bodies all seem to me to possibly also exist with one body. That is to say, I can't think of any of the relations which you mentioned, the thought of being looked at, speaking. All these are kind of relations which the body can establish within itself, kind of psychically. So as it were, it would be possible to think of kind of public space in terms of the solitude of a single body. Now, that might seem kind of a kind of rather perverse suggestion, since obviously kind of public normally goes with collective and social. But it seems to me to have the advantage that when one talks about the relation like within a body, what one's talking about is certain relations of uncertainty, say relations of uncertainty between conscious psychic life and unconscious psychic life, which actually, that uncertainty between the two seems to me one of the emergent notions of public space itself. So I can see that what I'm saying sounds very eccentric in terms of the history of political thought, where the social, the collective, the public always conjure up images of like the many, and because that enables you to put forward a dialectic of like the one and the other. But that's actually a relation which can exist within the one. So instead of, as it were, needing perhaps the classical arithmetic of many people, it's within the division of the subject, which is why many people would talk about the body, that one can generate a notion of public space. Sorry, go on, say that.
I'm not sure I agree. I mean, there are some kind of relative dimensions to your comment that don't trouble me. I would go this far. There's no doubt in my mind that that within the kinds of territories I've been, portraying to you here, the actual presence of the other is not necessary for as a kind of permanent condition, or it's not for the kinds of experiences that I've been attempting to depict to come into play. But I would say that's because of the kind of sort of memory of, rather than it being because it can happen, within the single body, which I kind of doubt as a kind of an ongoing basis, as an ongoing condition, but only because one would always have the recollection of how it was yesterday afternoon or the day before or last week. Indeed, I would say, I think one of the kind of interesting social psychological characteristics of space is, the room which is normally full but which is empty, or, I know my first visit to Hong Kong, I was always astonished at over the cycle of the day, the difference between the degree of inhabitation of the street in the morning and the late afternoon is astonishing, for example. So that, the condition of absence as the kind of, representation of presence is certainly a palpable one within this kind of discussion. So far so good, I would say. But I I mean, I'm very conscious of, I mean, for Arendt, you know, you don't even know who you are until you are among men. So you don't, you know who you are by virtue of who other, you learn who you are from your peers, because it's by virtue of their view of you that who you are comes to be manifest. So I would be inclined to think that it would be hard for me to imagine an idea of the body in public alone for very long that didn't go a bit pathological. But so at that level we may have a real disagreement.
Well, I mean, just very briefly in response, I mean, you said that you were kind of radically skeptical about the claims of kind of virtual reality to fundamentally kind of change the organizations of human experience, and I absolutely agree. And one of the reasons why I think that is, as it were, because of their inability to take seriously the presence of the single body. I mean, as it were, they're saying, since we've now kind of removed, they rely on a peculiarly theological notion of real presence of the body, and therefore overstate the consequences of virtual reality. So I think there are some advantages